My name is Matthew Weinberg. I have the great pleasure to be the CEO of the Weinberg Group. And while I am not obviously as technically proficient as my colleagues who are going to be speaking to you shortly, I thought I would just take a second and explain why we did this. As you can see, we are no longer just the Weinberg Group. We are now part of the ProPharma Group company, which means, like many of you, I found a way to monetize the primary asset in my personal portfolio. But what we really did was join a global organization that provides a range of services to pharmaceutical companies. Their primary business, about 50% of their revenue, is in the MIPV space, which doesn't really matter, I think, to most of the people here. What matters more to me is that we've joined forces with an organization called Southwood Research, so that we are actually now the only organization that really provides both preclinical, clinical, and post-market regulatory services to companies around the world. Southwood, represented by Colin, who's their founder and CEO, is a company that deals primarily in the European space, CTAs, MEAs, that kind of thing. And Steve Jensen, our Executive Vice President, is going to talk about the FDA universe. And so together we think we can actually help anybody who wants to do development, drug development, or device development, or biologics development, kind of anywhere in the world. We have now put together, we have about 400 current clients between us. The Weinberg Group's been in business for over almost 37 years in March, which is quite a long time, actually. And I've been there 35 of those years. So I'll be around afterwards if you have any questions, but in order to get us started, we all have places we need to be after this. I presume I'm going to let Steve get started and teach us about INDs. The only thing I'll say in advance is, I said this to someone before, everybody needs one, not just because you can't do your clinical trials without them, but because it really enables you to raise a lot more money. Getting an IND, in our estimation, increases the value of your firm about 10 times and simply lets you start the process with the FDA. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. First of all, I just want to, in terms of forum here, as we go through the slides, let's make this interactive. Please ask any questions. I know everybody's bringing their own perspective to this, where you're at in your own programs within your own companies. So any questions, please let's stop and address those as best we can. And again, we're going to have early stage initial points of interaction, contact with FDA. The objectives of the meeting today provide the logistics, the timing, regulatory requirements associated with the meeting. So there are basically a pre-IND meeting, an end of phase 2 meeting, a type C guidance meeting, a pre-NDA / pre-BLA meeting. There's different agendas to those, and we're going to focus on the pre-IND. Pre-IND, as opposed to other meetings, is a company-decided combination of data versus concept. The FDA is an organization, but at the time of the pre-IND, you're certainly not going to have the level of data you have, as you're into phase 2, pre-BLA, etc. Tips for preparing meeting request letters, briefing packages. There's some key elements there. Key points to keep in mind when preparing for the meeting. Who should attend the meeting? This has always been a stickler, and I want to address that. Understanding the differences between discussion, debate, negotiation. Negotiation with FDA is not like negotiation in any other sense of your life. How to present ideas, answers, questions, how to engage FDA in discussion. Okay, so what is the pre-IND meeting and why ask for one? Well, it's your initial point of contact with the FDA on a particular program. FDA meetings are product-based. We often have clients come to us that say, hey, we have a core technology. We want to go talk to FDA about that. That's not what a pre-IND meeting is. They want to talk about a product. They want to understand what your target population, your intended indication, and they want to understand. Many times, if you're developing a product for acne, they have a very well-beaten pathway. They can tell you exactly how to get that product to market. If you have a product that is a novel dosage form, novel route of administration, or an indication that has never been approved before, there's a lot more to discuss with FDA. And so it's getting FDA introduced to your program, where you're going, what you have in terms of maybe animal efficacy modeling data. And you want to get FDA excited, get FDA engaged in your program. One of the things I like to say, FDA loves to pat themselves on the back. They love to put out press releases for new therapies that they've brought to underserved populations. And so getting them engaged and excited about your program is something that you want to accomplish early in your program. Personally, face-to-face meetings are that human element, the relationship is always important, but a face-to-face meeting is only one of several formats for a meeting. Teleconferences, written responses only, and so we can talk a little bit about that. I think everybody should be familiar. This is the classic development pathway here. Early clinical, preclinical, non-clinical animal work. Maybe there's some toxicity data, maybe there's some animal efficacy proof of concept data. But it is at a time where you don't have an open IND, obviously. You have not discussed the program with FDA in any formality. And so this is when you want to go. So I want to elaborate on this. Most of our clients are mid to small size. And so for them, FDA minutes represent value. Value represents going out and raising capital. And, it's the chicken and the egg. They need the minutes in order to go generate the data, in order to go generate the capital, to secure the capital. And so companies have to make those, it's a business decision. How early do you go? The less data you have to discuss with FDA, the less precise the responses are going to be. It's more going to be, go look at this guidance, go look at this guidance, and you're not going to get those answers. So the more data that you can take to the meeting at the pre-IND stage, and a lot of times our first point of engagement with a client is doing a strategy for them, and out of that strategy is a recommendation. Go do this test, this test, this test, and these animal models. A lot of clients will, a really hot ticket item these days is clients going and doing some early clinical work down in Australia. Australia has a lot of incentives for doing that. And so outside of an IND, going and doing, or other territories, South America maybe it is, going and doing some of the clinical work and bringing some actual human data to FDA to discuss at your pre-IND meeting. And sometimes those are things that it is important to do to really engage FDA. But we're going to focus at the early end of this continuum. Okay, so the process itself. Before you request a meeting, make sure you are actually ready to have the meeting. And this is what I was talking about. Don't go too early. I have been to FDA meetings, pre-IND meetings specifically with clients because their upper management just absolutely mandated that they go. And it was, hey, we think this is going to treat this population and this is how it's going to do it. And FDA's like, okay, come back and show us when you can do it. And that's the outcome of the meeting. It's the minutes from those meetings have zero value whatsoever. On the other hand, we have a pre-IND meeting scheduled. The client already has the product approved in about a dozen countries, but they're an ex-US company, now want to come and introduce their product to FDA. They've got 12 clinical studies, 3 pivotal phase 3 trials. It's an enormous package of data. And so they want to have the pre-IND meeting. They want to come out of that, submit the meeting request letter for the pre-NDA meeting, and then submit the NDA. And they want to do this, before the middle of 2020. So they come in all different shapes and sizes. But be prepared. Are you ready to provide a comprehensive briefing package to FDA? FDA meetings, as most of you I'm sure are aware, are based on questions and answers. 90% of the time, these are binary yes, no questions. This is our position. This is what we are proposing. Be it, this is the study we want to do. Does FDA agree with our position? Yes, no. On occasion, and a lot of times I equate it to the Hail Mary, you want to throw that open-ended question out there. Hey, we've done this, what does FDA think? And try to get them engaged. So, but as a starting point, it's yes, no questions. FDA expects the sponsor knows what they're doing. They're experienced, they're professionals, they understand the guidances, the regulations, and FDA does not consider themselves a consulting company to the pharmaceutical industry. And so it is on the sponsor to know what they're doing, and it's FDA to be those guide rails, to keep them on, and no, we want to see this, we want to see that. FDA sees the inside of industry, and they have to maintain the level playing field. Very often we have companies come to us. We're just a small company. We're not Glaxo. We're not Pfizer. We can't do all of this. So we should have a smaller program. FDA's responsibility is to protect the American consumer. They don't care who's producing the product. They want to make sure that it's pure, efficacious, et cetera, et cetera. And so the product, when you request the pre-IND meeting, make sure that you're prepared to answer these. And again, the more data you can bring to this, the better. But again, sometimes companies have a very short runway of liquidity to get them down the road, and sometimes those it's not necessary. This last bullet point is a little outdated. In May of 2017, FDA mandated that all submissions, including INDs, are in electronic format and are submitted through the ESG. There are exceptions, just like learning English in school. Every rule, there's an exception to the rule. I am aware of a client who just submitted to DAP, the Division of Anesthesia, Analgesia, and Addiction Products. They're still accepting, on occasion, paper-based meeting requests and briefing documents. No other division that I'm aware of right now is doing that. And I don't know how long that's going to continue. But be prepared to work into your timeline and have a electronic publisher ready to go. We have, if you were to work with the Weinberg group or whatever group or prepare it yourself, affiliate yourself with an electronic publisher. They're very good at what they do. What should go into a meeting request? Well, there is a template. There is a December 2017 guidance on FDA formal meetings with industry. Within that, they not only discuss the timelines associated with meeting requests, granting of meetings, when the briefing books are due, the granting of the meetings, etc. It lays out the content, and it gives you a very nice template of what the meeting request letter as well as the briefing document should look like. You can also, when you work with your electronic publisher, you can get those templates that can just be populated and they go right into their electronic publishing system. Any questions at this point? Okay. And again, this goes into, this is a second page. Some of it is non-applicable. Your pediatric study plan. At the time of your pre-IND, I would put non-applicable. You're not prepared to discuss your pediatric study plan. Human factors engineering. If you are submitting a single ingredient, small chemical non-combination product, clearly human factors may not be non-applicable, but it is part of their standard template. The format of the meeting matters. Face-to-face has significant benefits, as I noted on earlier. Developing relationships. You know, right now we do a lot of work in the business space. So we work a lot with the Division of Psychiatry. The director of the Division of Psychiatry right now, she's also a practicing physician, and she specializes in pediatric autism patients. And so she has a very personal connection. Having those meetings directly with the psychiatry division are very beneficial, because you can see in the discussions with her, well, she knows exactly what's important for her patients that she's seeing on a regular basis, as opposed to a written response, which receiving a written response meeting for a pre-IND, it's not uncommon, and it's not a sign that FDA doesn't like your product. I'll go back to DAP, anesthesia, analgesia, and addiction. What are they dealing with right now? We've got the opioid crisis going on. They are the tip of the spear with everything going on there. Every single opioid that comes through that is a controlled release is mandated to go to an advisory committee meeting. We submitted a request for a pre-IND meeting, which has a 60-day clock, back in August. They granted the meeting in late December. So they're not even paying attention to the guidance. They are way behind. So if you're in that space, be prepared for longer timelines, and I will almost guarantee you your pre-IND meeting will be a written response online.
Quick question.
Yes?
So if ultimately it's the FDA's choice, whether it's a face-to-face meeting or written response, what makes a good case to get yourself to a face-to-face meeting? What
So there's a specific item in here, meeting format. I would recommend 100% of the time put face-to-face. They will come back and they will DAP at a pre-IND. I guarantee you they'll say, okay, we're going to give you written responses. I have had with the Office of Non-Prescription Products, which is not as busy as other divisions, where we've requested written responses. And they're like, no, please come on in. We want you. We've got time next Tuesday if you guys can come in and visit with us. So, you know, they're not as busy as other divisions. But the human, in a written response, you know, things get lost in, you know, things are misinterpreted. I always warn staff training, be careful when you're writing your emails, things get misinterpreted, tone, etc. And so face-to-face meetings are those opportunities to clarify those things. If something in a briefing document is written and the tone or the interpretation is off, the meeting, the face-to-face, is the time to clarify that. So my recommendation, it's not always convenient. About a third of our clients are ex-US clients. And so to have them have to travel to Washington, D.C., even West Coast clients to travel to Washington, D.C., it's a hassle. It's disruptive to everybody's got their, you know, other responsibilities. I don't expect everybody in here is working on just one product. You've got a lot of work to do. And so, but to get the most benefit out of it, sitting across the table, having that dialogue, you know, neurology, the current director of neurology, Billy Dunn, is great in dialogue. You know, he wants to bring, and right now, you see in the news with CBD, cannabidiol. So there's everything going on at the state level, but we're also taking products through the conventional pharmaceutical development, controlled, blinded trials. And you saw last year with GW's approval. And so they see the promise in these products for these patients. Not only in the epilepsy, we see it in autism, we see it in other areas. And so engaging in dialogue with them and helping them understand. A lot of the clinical teams, they did practice medicine, some still do, but they're not necessarily on the cutting lines. And so we'll get to attendees at the meeting, but bringing people and really, I use the term loosely, educating them onto what is currently going on in clinical practice. That's very insightful. And you don't have that full opportunity in written responses or even teleconferences for that matter sometimes.
Steve?
Yes?
What do you like to see when a client comes to you as far as a package that's well prepared for you to digest and groom to take to the FDA?
What's ideal for us, honestly, is we want to see your source data. So we're talking IND here today. We'd like to see your animal studies. CMC, clinical, non-clinical, they do overlap. What you have going on in your formulation and in your impurities impacts what's going to happen in your toxicity program. That's going to have an impact on your clinical program in terms of adverse reactions. So we like to see, number one, what is the clinical protocol? What do you want to accomplish in your IND opening first-in-man studies? What non-clinical animal work do you have from a safety perspective to support that? Have you established, a no adverse effect level in your molecule that you're looking at? And so seeing that data, we like to write the briefing document based on those. We really like to get involved in when the non-clinical labs are finishing up and, okay, what is the interpretation? What are the themes coming out of that? Because those need to align with the story that you're telling in your briefing document. Many clients come to us, okay, we've done the studies, the CROs have signed off on them, the non-clinical CROs, and we've drafted the briefing document, and we get into it, and there's a complete misalignment, misinterpretation. And so we have to back it up and going through that process. So there's a lot of very seasoned clients that we have that they just need some help, just plug a hole here, plug a hole there. But what we want to see is what was learned in your studies is articulated clearly in your briefing document, and the questions that are being asked are based on what we've seen, data-driven. This is where we're taking it. Does the FDA agree? And getting them on board. Yeah, absolutely. This is where we think you're going. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
You
Yes.
may be getting to it later, but can you give us a sense of time, how you would recommend to prepare? How long should we?
Yeah, I'm gonna get to that, absolutely, yeah, because that's very important. And again, I'll also refer you to the December 2017 FDA guidance, which is a great guidance and really spells out those. Okay, so your meeting request has been granted. You will, yes?
So, where you say proposed regulatory pathway, as part of the meeting request letter, can you shed some light on that? What do you?
On the regulatory pathway?
Yeah.
Okay, was that on the previous slide?
Yeah.
What did I do? On the right slide?
The two slides ahead of that. The previous one. One more, and then, like that, proposed regulatory pathway.
Okay. So FDA wants to understand what is your regulatory pathway. So let's assume we are in the small molecule world, CEDAR. There are 3 regulatory pathways. There is first of all, there's the 505J. Let's take that off the table. The 505J is the ANDA. We're not talking ANDAs here today. In the new drug world, there's the 505B1 and there's 505B2. 505B1 typically is a new chemical entity, and all data in that package is proprietary to the sponsor of the study. They've either conducted the studies themselves or the studies have been conducted on their behalf, but they own the data, 100% of the dossier. The 505B2, and this goes back to Hatch-Waxman, you are relying on prior determinations that FDA has made. So, for instance, just making this up, you have a molecule that's been approved, and it's been approved as an injectable form. Your company is developing it as a solid oral. And so systemic toxicity has already been established, and FDA has already determined that at certain levels they're comfortable with that. You do a bridging study, and we don't have time to get into all of the details of bridging studies, etc. But you demonstrate that your systemic concentrations are no higher than the injectable form. FDA does not require you to go and do all of those same animal studies. You can refer to what's called the listed drug. It's the listed drug in the VO2 world. And you are able to rely on those FDA prior determinations. Now, the second point, B, you can also rely on published literature. There may be animal studies out there that you can rely on that provide that same level of information that FDA needs in order to say, okay, this is safe from this perspective. Now, the difference between a solid and an oral, this might be a lozenge. And so FDA may want to see toxicity studies around, are there any, oropharyngeal, so there's other toxicity studies that may need to. But if you're able to carve out 30% of the studies, 30% of your budget. Secondly, on the clinical side, if FDA's already determined that this molecule works, is efficacious, you typically would only need to do a single pivotal clinical study. And that's when the real dollars start to add up. So. Okay, meeting request granted. So you will, prior to submitting your meeting request letter, you'll contact FDA and you will request a Pre-IND number. You'll get a Pre-IND number. You'll be assigned a project manager. This is your point of contact at FDA. You will submit your formal request for your meeting. In the formal request, you cite your draft questions. FDA looks at those draft questions for 2 reasons only. Number one, are you asking questions that warrant a meeting? And we've had clients decline because they just want to know, hey, do you like this drug? Do you think it's awesome? FDA's not going to grant you a meeting on that. Number 2, they want to know what disciplines they need to invite to the meeting. Okay, they want to discuss CMC, they want to discuss clinical, they want to discuss non-clinical. This is a combination product, so they need to invite some folks from CDRH to the meeting, that sort of thing. And also in that, you have an opportunity to request who you feel should attend from FDA. Okay. Yes?
So just as drafting the questions for the Pre-IND meeting, should they just be very cut and dry, these are the questions, or should you include like a preview of some of the data that would support the position?
anytime you can present data and ask questions around data, I strongly encourage it. So ideally, a non-clinical program between FDA's guidances and ICH guidances, it's very clear what FDA wants to see from a non-clinical animal work in order to get into particularly first-in-man studies, NCEs. And so very often it is, okay, here is the 28-day rat study that we did. This is the opening clinical trial we want to do. It's for an acute indication. Based on these data, does that support the safety of moving into this opening with this clinical trial? Yes, no. Does the FDA agree? So it's based, that's a question based on, in your briefing document, you've summarized the data that's come out of that animal study. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Similarly, in the CMC area, okay, here's our formulation. We're doing a orally dissolving tablet. Here's the data. Here's the first 3 to 6 months of stability data that we're looking at. We're not using any novel excipients. These are the levels. Does FDA agree that we don't need to do any additional, that all of the excipients are in the inactive ingredient guideline? Does FDA agree that this formulation should be acceptable? Those types of things. But over data. Yes?
Do you recommend, before we put together questions for a meeting request, do you recommend working on a briefing documents first?
Great point. When I open Steve Jensen Pharmaceuticals, one of the policies will be that the briefing document is very mature by the time you submit your meeting request letter. You start with, first of all, I recommend no more than 10 to 12 questions. And in fact, we've seen, if any of you are working in the oncology space, DOP2 is putting a cap on no more than 10 questions. And that doesn't mean you can ask question 1, 1A, 1B, 1C. It's total questions, and they're very explicit about that. And so have your briefing document prepared, because your briefing document is all FDA has in order to provide you with an answer. Very rarely, and particularly at the pre-IND stage, they're not going to go and do their own research on this. They're not going to go do a lit search. They're going to read your briefing document. And I had a early mentor of mine, when Steve, write that briefing document, it better be precise, it better be to the point, because that reviewer is reading that briefing document as he's running down the hall to the meeting. And in fact, I was on a call yesterday with FDA. As a side note, they are implementing a program for advisory committee meetings where historically there's been a sponsor briefing package, there's been a FDA briefing package, and FDA wants to now go with a single briefing package, which they call point counterpoint, or they're calling it project point counterpoint, because they're afraid that the advisory committee meetings aren't reading all of the content either. And so FDA basically is acknowledging that, we've only got so much time. We're raising families, we've got, mortgages to pay, So write the briefing document, make it very precise, make sure you've really fine-tuned your questions, submit your meeting request letter, and then be prepared. I've had cases where we've been caught that, hey, you submitted this, you want your meeting in 60 days, which is according to guidance. We had a last-minute cancellation. We can have you in here in 2.5 weeks if you can submit your briefing document in the next 48 hours. Do you want to take that? Otherwise, I may not be able to grant you a meeting for 4 months. So you don't want to, have to tell your boss that. It's very important making a clear, organized, well-presented. You want to make sure this looks like a very professional document. FDA will never acknowledge it, but they're going to establish an impression of you before you ever get there based on the quality of your briefing document. And so typos, different fonts, mistitled tables and figures, these all make a very big impression. Okay, internal meetings. FDA holds at least one internal meeting. They prepare their, what we call their preliminary responses. They provide it back to the sponsor, generally 2 days before the meeting. The sponsor then turns around and provides their sponsor responses. If there were originally 10 questions, maybe 6 of them are perfectly clear. You've only got an hour to discuss these with FDA. You want to narrow that list down. And so come back with your sponsor responses. Hey, number 1, 5, 7, 8, 9, and 10 were very clear. We just want to discuss these others. Here's our response to that, and this is the order we want to discuss them in. At the end of that hour, literally, FDA will get up, turn around, and walk out of the room. They're not going to say, hey, I don't have anything else going on, let's talk for another 20 minutes. So don't go in and say, okay, we want to discuss at length all 10 questions with you. Narrow it down. So I just want to end with some tips for a successful meeting. And these are what we've learned over the years. As I've been trying to hammer home, be prepared. If not, you're not going to know what to do. And making what's the saying, you only get, one chance to make a good first impression. Make sure you do that. Put the time in. And also make sure it's based on data. I'm sorry, I'm just slide behind here. I'm looking at 2 slides on the screen. Number 2, be knowledgeable. Know what you're talking about. They're going to. They see a lot of this. The odds are they've seen programs similar to yours in your patient population, potentially even your molecule. Know who you're talking to. Do your research. There is a lot of change in FDA these days. We've also recently seen an announcement that FDA is going to be dividing up divisions. I know that the non-prescription division is going to be divided now into 2 non-prescription divisions. I know that GI and inborn errors is going to be divided into 3 different divisions. What is it? GI, liver, and then inborn errors. And so get to know who you're talking to. And you will over the years. Be confident and thorough. Be the biggest cheerleader of your data. And FDA, get them enthusiastic and again, it's database. We can't control how the molecule acts, but present it in the best light possible. Be cooperative. They're not cops. My approach has always been at both the individual and at the division level. What do I need to give you for you to give me a yes? They don't want to sign off on something that years gets pulled from the market and there ended up being why that is. Know your flaws. Don't mind your flaws. Shed light. Development is ugly. Development is not a straight line. And if you think that your program, has a bunch of warts and has a lot of problems, you're not alone. They all do. Be honest. trying to get away with something, misrepresenting something, speculating, it doesn't pay off. Everything is going to have a red hot light shined on it at some point in time. Be serious. This is serious stuff. FDA has a very serious mission here, and they want to bring therapies that help people, that help our fellow citizens here. Listen carefully to what they have to say, what they need, what they want. The questions and meeting package, writing the script. Again, frame your questions with the agency with great care. Open-ended questions have a place, but typically it's a binary yes/no question. Here's what we want. Here's why we believe it's based in science. It's based on data. Does FDA agree? You can get creative. You don't have to go exactly according to guidance, but it needs to follow good scientific practice. Who should attend a meeting? My rule has always been, if you're attending the meeting, it's because you have an active role in that meeting. It's funny. You stand in the lobby at FDA. You're waiting for your meeting. You're there 30 minutes early, and you see a bus pull up, and a company comes out, and they're there for their meeting. They've got 35 people and in and around you, wondering what is going on here? What are they doing? Have a note taker. Have somebody who's designated to moderate the meeting. If it's a clinical-based focus, have your clinicians there. You want to maybe potentially, if it's appropriate, bring in some external key opinion leaders on that. I don't speak statistician. If there are going to be significant stat issues, bring somebody who speaks that language. You want, somebody speaking the language who's sitting across the table from FDA. If smaller companies, a lot of times the CEOs just want to attend, want to hear it firsthand. That's the CEO's prerogative, whether they say a word or not. But, rule of thumb, limit it to whoever has an active role in the meeting. Not so much these days. It used to be however many people you invite to the meeting, FDA is going to invite more. They're going to outnumber you. I don't see that little game played as much anymore, but it used to be enjoyable. At the meetings, stick to the script. Don't come up with a novel idea that you think is genius in the middle of the meeting that you haven't discussed with your team prior to that. Be well prepared. You've deliberated with your team. People love to hear themselves talk a lot of times, especially if you are bringing a KOL. Make sure they understand what they're there for. And then finally, after the meeting, we like to prepare and present to FDA a set of sponsor minutes. A lot of times, depending on the division, the minutes can influence the FDA authoring of their own minutes. So you can get your points in there, but noting the official minutes to the meeting will be produced by FDA, but at least getting that submitted, becomes a formal part of the record, something you may be able to point to down in the future. Not in today's agenda, but obviously there are a lot of other meetings, type A, hopefully, type A meetings are critical. There are different types of type B meetings, Pre-IND, EOP type B meetings, EOP, and EOP2, and then pre-BLA meetings. Type C meetings, which we're seeing more and more type C guidance meetings. They're very common. And you have all these slides in here.
Steve,
Yes?
your presentation contemplates FDA, then EMA. Is that a proven process? Can it go the other way? Obviously it can, but is it better to go FDA and and then over to Europe, or doesn't matter?
I don't think there's a right answer to that, and Colin's gonna come in and speak next. We've worked with companies who, they're US based, they're US focused, ultimately they want to, we work with clients who are ex-US, who only want to work in the US. We have clients whose products are approved. We have a client whose product's approved in over 50 countries, and they're just now coming to the US. There is communication, and Colin can speak more to this maybe, between FDA and EMA on I guess, some products. FDA and EMA do not always agree on use, on approaches to clinical trials, for instance. So I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer to that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think there's lots of examples where companies perhaps might do a trial in the EU first, because you don't have to open an IND, and you could go to an individual country, get some phase 1 data, and then take that as part of your package to open your IND. There are companies that are very much focused on, as Steve said, on the US as a primary focus, and want to get an IND open because that's a real driver of value, and hitting that regulatory milestone is really important for organisations. So I don't think there is a hard and fast rule, and we have a similar mix of companies that we work with in different stages.
I think it largely depends on a company's capabilities, financially, resource-wise, what they're able to do. So.
Earlier you said size, the FDA just doesn't care. What about the EMA? Are they more friendly to smaller organizations than FDA?
I'm going to hand it over to Colin.
Thanks. Leave the tough questions for me.
Well, that was a softball.
Yeah.
Before you move on to the European
Yes.
FDA, I've been in different companies, and in some companies we go into a pre-IND meeting before we've done a tox. And in other companies we do the tox study so that the pre-IND brings the tox data. Any perspective on why one versus the other?
The thing about going in before you have those tox data, you're likely to get a response of, I refer you to ICH guidance this, I refer you to ICH guidance that. Non-clinical is very well articulated in guidance, what's necessary. And so it's not until, if you want to talk about study design, they're going to point you to guidance. If you want to talk about study outcomes, they're prepared to do that. It depends on your particular scenario. I'd love to talk to you about, I don't mean to steal all of Colin's airtime here, but there are all kinds of strategies. You get one pre-IND meeting, type B meeting. But one common strategy that we're seeing more and more of is a sponsor will schedule a type B pre-IND meeting to discuss their non-clinical and clinical program, and then they will request a type C CMC focused meeting, because they may not be completely aligned in the development, how far down the road they are, and FDA may grant that, and then they're prepared to submit their IND.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. So, my name is Colin Wheeler. I'm head up a group called Southwood Research, who are also part of the ProPharma group, and we operate primarily in the European Union, but also support companies with their regulatory, navigate the regulatory pathways in other countries, including New Zealand, Australia, Turkey, Switzerland. So we cover quite a lot of the sort of rest of world regulatory issues, but we're talking primarily today about the European Medicines Agency and how we get trials open in Europe and progress the regulatory milestones in the EU. So one of the things that we're going to cover today, and it's a kind of whistle-stop tour through these big issues, will be, I guess, the common issues faced in starting clinical trials in the European Union. But I also want to talk about some other regulatory major milestones that we need to navigate in Europe. The Pediatric Investigation Plan, or the PIP, is something that is a very common pitfall which companies can introduce delays in their program because of it. But also talk a little bit about orphan medicines, scientific advice, and the regulatory pathway. I'll be talking about the centralised procedure today. There are other regulatory pathways in the European Union, but mostly we use the centralised procedure these days. So in terms of starting clinical trials in the EU, the good news is that you don't have to have an IND. But it's a double-edged sword, because instead of having an IND and you have one approval which allows you to conduct trials under that, you actually have to apply for individual approval for each clinical trial in each country which you are planning to conduct that study in. And also you would be required to have ethical approval in each individual country. Sometimes in each individual site. It depends on how you approach it. So before a clinical trial can start in any EU member state or EU country, you have to have a positive opinion from the Ethics Committee, or the IRB, and approval from the competent authority. And they require slightly different documents. There are some common documents that both organisations require: the protocol, investigator brochure, power of attorney. But then the competent authority requires something called an investigational medicinal product dossier, which is commonly abbreviated to IMPD. Now, often, if a company has an IND open, we often use the IND as the kind of source document, or the IMPD to open trials in the European Union. So it has similar information which is included within it. But there are various other requirements in terms of sort of labelling, import authorisations. You have to have a qualified person declaration for a non-EU drug product. So there's a package of information that's required. Similarly, the Ethics Committee have a unique package of information that's required, and that does differ slightly between countries. But as you might imagine, it's not that different to what you'd expect in the US in terms of what is required by the IRB: patient information, informed consents, any type of patient-facing documents, ID cards or diaries, that type of thing would be expected. And then the clinical trial agreement, so the contract and the budget and trial participant insurance and so on are things that the Ethics Committee like to see. Now, the process for getting those trials approved is an iterative one in many ways. So you submit your package, and then it undergoes validation, which is effectively saying, are all the documents that we expect to see included? It doesn't actually review the content, it's just looking at the documents and do you have the right documents included? And they'll come back to you and ask you any questions around that. And then it undergoes review, and then you get questions back from the competent authorities. And it's actually quite helpful, because it's not a simple yes, no. You'll get comments back, and they'll say, we'd like you to do this, or we think you should increase the trial participant insurance, or we'd like you to amend the informed consent to state this. What you're trying to avoid through this process, I guess, are major protocol amendments for individual countries, particularly if you're conducting international trials. And then once you have the approval from both the EU competent authority and the ethics committee, you can start trials in the country. So the European Medicines Agency doesn't, as a kind of European group, get involved in the review and approval of clinical trials. That's all done at a country level. And this is why choosing the countries that you decide to conduct trials in and which trials you conduct in those countries is quite an important step. Some are much easier to get open and get started. So, for example, in the UK, which is still currently in the European Union, although by the time I return in a couple of days, it may not. In the UK, the MHRA, the National Competence Authority there, state that if you're doing a phase 1 trial, they'll review it and give you a decision within 14 days. So the UK is actually a pretty attractive place to do phase 1 studies, and there's sort of phase 1 centres. So, and there are sort of processes by which you can kind of speed through that process. But the European Medicines Agency don't actually get involved in that. There is a kind of something called the Voluntary Harmonisation Procedure, VHP, and on paper this is a great idea because at the moment we have to submit to individual countries, individual ethics committee, and VHP came in, which was an intent to harmonise the divergent kind of comments that you get from different countries. The key features of this were that you submit it to one submission point. There would be a single submission. There's a clear timetable, and you would get a single feedback on your clinical trial from a number of individual EU countries. Now, that sounds great on paper. In practice, it's something that doesn't really work very well, unfortunately. And I mean, the pros are that you get this sort of single, there's a single submission that goes in. Our experience of this has not been a positive one, to be perfectly frank, in that it's very, very challenging to get harmonised comments back on a protocol, and it can take a very long time to do that. Countries can actually decline to participate in it. So some of them don't participate at all. Some countries may decline to participate in it. And what you often end up with is the fourth bullet here is a strong voice. One of the countries that you're going to who believes very strongly that something should be done. There might be some national clinical practice guidelines that they think should be adhered to within the protocol, and they then will, I guess, almost push the other countries that are reviewing your protocol into doing that. So generally, unless it's something that's a very straightforward protocol, which is non-contentious, following clinical practice, and is a very large trial with multiple countries that we think this would be appropriate for. It's actually generally, although it's a bit more time and effort up front, it's generally better to go down the individual country submission, and that's what we recommend to most companies that we work with. So coming on to talk about the paediatric plans. So yes, question about.
If you file in an individual country, can you still file in English? Or do you have to file in the native language?
It's in the native language. We do all the translations and activities for all of the European member states. So we spend a lot of money on translations. And actually, a lot of the time there's a requirement to translate into the local language and then translate back into English to ensure that the meaning isn't lost. So it's quite a lot of work. Often the protocols and things like the investigative brochures will just be in English, but certain key documents will be required to be in local language. Often, all of the patient-informed consents and so on would be required. Often the application form for the individual member state is in the local language as well.
Do you have face-to-face meeting in native language also, or there's no face-to-face?
Almost every face-to-face meeting that's conducted with national agencies is conducted in English. So if you go for scientific advice or pre-CTA advice, it's always done in English. And that's the language of the European Medicines Agency, even though it's now left the UK. So one of the regulatory requirements within the EU is to develop a paediatric investigation plan, and this is absolutely pivotal and a critical step, which companies sometimes overlook the importance of. And the importance of this, as well as generating additional patent protection and data exclusivity, are that you cannot apply for you cannot submit your drug for approval in the European Union unless you have an agreed PIP. Now there are exceptions if you have a class waiver, but the majority of the time companies are required to have a paediatric investigational plan. And the scope of that PIP covers both CMC non-clinical and clinical measures. And it may be something like, developed from a CMC perspective, developing an age-appropriate formulation, a solution rather than a tablet, an oral version rather than an IV or a subcut version. And then they may be interested in non-clinical studies, juvenile tox, developmental studies within animals, and clinical measures as well. So actually studying how your treatment works in children in a stepwise fashion. And the paediatric committee, which is called PEDCO within the European Union, expects that your agreed PIP could lead to a full paediatric indication. So it's a development plan. And you also have to justify this within each paediatric age group. So that's from adolescents 13 to 18, all the way down to preterm infants. And each age group has to be justified. If you're asking for a waiver, that has to be justified. So it's quite a complex program, and it usually takes at least 1 year to reach agreement with the paediatric committee. Now, most companies wait until they're probably in sort of end of phase 2 before they start to think about the paediatric plan, and that's usually too late because it's always gets squeezed towards the end as companies are approaching filing their MAA, and we generally recommend that this is something you start to think about in phase 1 or perhaps towards the end of phase 1, just because of the time it takes to negotiate it. Often the first PIP that is submitted is not successful and has to be withdrawn, rethought, discussed with the agency, and then resubmitted. So it does take a long time. PEDCO are also notorious for asking for the moon when they ask for the program that they want companies to do. They often ask for things that companies don't want to do that might be considered unreasonable or difficult to complete. So there's a big negotiation piece that goes along with this as well. Yes?
Quick question. For orphan products, does the PIP negotiation, is it part of the scientific advice oversight of, like the interactions that will enable you to have scientific advice?
Yes, so for orphans, you go to a separate committee, which is COMP.
And they handle PIPs as well?
No,
okay.
But the PIP is managed separately. So you have to. So for an orphan pediatric condition, you're dealing with the CHMP, which is the Human Medicinal Products Group, COMP, which is orphans, and PEDCO, which is the pediatric committee. Now, often, if you went for scientific advice, there would be representation from each of those groups to give you single scientific advice based on the questions that you're asking.
So you don't have to deal with them and meet with them separately. You can have a meeting that can include representatives from each of the committees.
You can do for scientific advice, yes. So during I guess the various pediatric submissions that you need to think about during your development program are the initial PIP, which we've talked about, and then PIP modifications. As you develop data, you may need to change your pediatric program. Then we have this thing called a compliance check, and before you submit your marketing authorization, you have to show that you're in compliance with your pediatric plan. And almost always, companies are not in compliance with their pediatric plan at that point, and we have to then submit a PIP modification. If you're not in compliance, in order to file your MAA, you have to have this piece of paper from the pediatric committee that says this company is in compliance with their PIP. If you don't have it, you can't file your MAA. So this is often a mad scramble for companies that approach us late in the day and say, we want to file our MAA in a year's time. And then we say, okay, what stage is your PIP in? And we realise we've got to do a modification, then do a compliance check, and it takes 6 to 8 months to do that, and it gets pushed very tight at the end. But when you get to the end, what are the rewards? Well, if you complete your PIP, you don't necessarily have to show positive data. It can be that you do your pediatric plan and it shows that it's not appropriate for children, or it's not going to be used in children. But for non-orphans, you get a supplementary protection certificate for 6 months, so basically a 6-month patent extension. And for orphans, you get another 2 years to the data exclusivity. So these are the rewards at the end, which hopefully when a medicine's on the market by that point, it's something that's quite attractive. So moving on to talk briefly about orphan drug designation. The way that orphan is defined in the European Union is slightly different to the way it's done in the US. And we have a prevalence of less than 5 people per 10,000 in the EU or European Economic Area. But there's also this kind of caveat that it can also be classified that way if a company can demonstrate that they cannot generate sufficient return on investment to justify development. It should be a condition that's life-threatening or chronically debilitating, and should have either no satisfactory method of treating or demonstrates a significant benefit. There's a term significant benefit you hear in EU orphan discussions over existing methods. And significant benefit can be something as simple as being an oral formulation, whereas previously it was an IV formulation, or it can be something that is, shows very impressive efficacy compared to something that already exists. But so significant benefit is a bit more vague and is something that requires justification. The orphan drug application is the first step, and usually we put that in phase 1 or very early in phase 2. Sometimes companies do it even before they get into the clinic. And then we have a couple of other orphan maintenance activities. So there's an orphan maintenance report that you have to do annually in order to maintain your orphan designation. And at the point where you submit your marketing authorization, you have to show that there are, you have an orphan similarity report, which shows that there's no other orphans designated with a similar structure in the same indication. So these are, they're not that challenging to do, but a lot of the time they get kind of forgotten about till kind of late in the day, and companies are scrambling around trying to get this done. So in terms of scientific advice, there are 2 paths to scientific advice. There's going to national agencies, so individual European countries, or to the European Medicines Agency themselves. And there's pros and cons of doing either. And the national agencies will give you a national viewpoint. Sometimes you can go to them and get access to them quite quickly. And also there are some national agencies that are particularly specialist in certain areas. So for example, here we talked about PreIND, the Paul Ehrlich Institute in Germany. Companies that are developing biologics will often seek advice from PreIND because that's an area that they're very focused on. If you're developing something in oncology, you might want to go to Denmark or Sweden, where they've been rapporteurs for a number of recent oncology approvals. If you don't want to have national scientific advice, you can get centralised scientific advice from the European Medicines Agency, and that's from the Scientific Advice Working Party. And usually about probably just over half the time, you would get written advice from your scientific advice questions. Sometimes they would invite you for an oral discussion with the experts. And that's actually something that's a bit more common at the moment. But it's a lot more expensive. It's about up to €80,000 to do that in terms of fees, whereas the national advice is around €5,000 to €10,000. If it's orphan, it's free. And the advice is not legally binding, which is the first thing they tell you as you walk into the meeting and sit down. So you kind of, if you don't adhere to that advice, then you need to justify it, because there's nothing the agency like less than spending their time reading a briefing book, giving you scientific advice, and then finding out 3 years later when you submit your file that you've decided not to pay any attention to it. So these are the types of meetings that you have. So for national agencies, you might go for pre-CTA meetings, and that's clinical trial application meetings with national agencies. And we actually advise companies to do this that are working in advanced therapies, because the individual country requirements for advanced therapies are really quite unique. And getting pre-CTA advice is something that can help smooth that, particularly if you're putting in a GMO application at the same time for a genetically modified organism. And then from a centralized advice, you can do that for scientific advice and protocol assistant. We can also get joint European Medicines Agency and health technology advice. And there is a format to get parallel FDA and EMA advice, which sounds like, well, that'd be great. We get one set of advice, which gives us our global direction. But actually, what it gives you is, when they say you get parallel advice, it's not consolidated advice. You get two sets of advice, which doesn't always agree. So I'm not sure it's that helpful as it stands at the moment. But hopefully that will come together in time. And then lastly, I just wanted to give a very brief overview of the centralised procedure. So there are a number of paths to regulatory pathways in the European Union: centralised, decentralised, and mutual recognition. Most companies will look for a centralised procedure, which will be a single marketing authorization application, which gives you an approval in all 28 member states and the European Economic Area, which includes Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, at the same time. And that has significant advantages, and has actually been a real success story in terms of how drugs are brought through. This is mandatory now for a number of classes of product that come through. So, for example, all orphan medicines must go through the centralised advice. All oncology medicines must go through. All applications for neurodegenerative, most metabolic, particularly diabetes, it's all mandatory that they go through the centralised procedure these days. And then an overview of that centralised procedure, just to conclude. There's a fixed timetable which we work to. So you are in a pre-submission phase where you have discussions with your rapporteurs and the European Medicines Agency. Submit your dossier, and then clock starts, and that's day 1. At day 80, you get a list of questions, which are the draft questions in terms of what they think of your dossier. And then you get at day 120, you get a sort of final list of questions. And you then get 3 months to answer that. You can take less time if you're feeling ambitious, but usually 3 months is about what it takes to do that. And then the clock starts again at day 121 for the agency to look at your responses. And you get another draft report at day 157 with that finalised at day 180. The clock stops again, and at that point you get a month to respond to the outstanding questions. And then at day 181 the clock starts again. And then between day 181 and day 210 it becomes a bit more fluid as to what happens. You can have additional questions, you might get referred for an advisory committee, you may be required to present for an oral explanation. But at day 210 you get your opinion from the European Medicines Agency, and then there's a 67-day period where all the national translations and national authorizations are put in place, and at day 277 you have the approval from the European Commission, and then the drug is able to be used within the European Union. So, whistle-stop tour through European regulatory. I'll stop there. I think we're a few minutes after, but are there any questions or comments?
If you're going to go through a centralized procedure, would you go the national route for the scientific part, or would you then naturally go to the EMA?
I think companies do both. We'll do both, but I think generally, I think it depends on the stage of development you're at and the questions that you have. But I think if you are looking to kind of validate your sort of phase 3 study design and the acceptability for marketing authorization, then you might say, well, okay, let's go to get centralized advice. If you are looking for, specific CMC topic related to something that, that there's expertise within Denmark or France relating to, then you can go to that country. But I think we're probably finding more and more that we're pushing people towards getting centralised advice, just because it's generally more helpful. And we've had examples where we've had advice from a national agency who were then appointed to be the rapporteur for that product. And we've sat down with them 2 years after they've given us advice, and they've said, yeah, no, we've changed our view on that now. And that kind of stings.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. We'll be hanging out here for a couple of days if you have any individual questions you want to ask. If you have any others afterwards, you've got all the emails used to sign up for this. So thank you. We appreciate your time.